Welcome to our study on the book of Ephesians. This is session 59. Let's start by reading the passage here in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And ye masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. Now the first part of this passage is to the servants, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, but in a very specific role, and that is how to make an appeal to those who are in positions of authority. And what we're really talking about here is, this is where we left off in our previous session. It may be that in the course of your work, someone who is your boss or employer may ask you to do something that is wrong or illegal or sinful or contrary, to the Bible. And I'm not just talking about our preferences or what we like. I'm really talking about what they're asking you to do is either considered to be against the law, or it is just evil in God's eyes. It's just wrong. It's just sinful. In those cases, what do we do? And of course, I'm just going to, we're going to read this verse again in verse 5 in just a moment. But this is going to be, and your note taker, I know you've got it in front of you, we're going to fill out all the steps about what to do to have a godly response to that. So let's start by rereading verse 5 and focusing on the first part of that verse. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh. Now, the Bible is not instructing us to commit sin in order to be obedient. I think everybody gets that, but every once in a while I have heard that question. When the Bible tells us to obey, are we just supposed to do it no matter what, and God doesn't hold us responsible? No, we are going to be responsible. But we also understand that there is a godly way to suffer for not doing wrong, and there is a wrong way to suffer as well for not doing wrong. And I want to talk about that today. And in fact, we'll explain that now. If you are ever asked by someone, and we're talking about within the institution of work, so if you're ever told by an authority figure in your work to do something that you believe is morally wrong, or is sinful, or a violation of the law, you would refuse to do that. And if you do, you may suffer in some way. Now, when that happens, it's really easy for us to think, hey, I'm suffering for Christ, so you know what, I'm good here with all of this. But here's the thing I want to make sure we understand. There's a wrong way to decline an evil command. And that wrong way begins ever before we got that, instruction to do the wrong thing. It started way before that. What we're going to do now is look at these 6 steps one by one of what we do when we're asked to do something that's wrong. And actually, the first 2 steps take place before you have ever been asked to do something that's wrong. And these are important steps if we want that process to work. Because here's what you're after. You want to be in a position that if authority asks you to do something that is wrong, that you know exactly what to do so that you can change the mind of the person that is in authority. And I say so that you can change their mind, but actually what you're doing is you're giving God an opportunity to change their mind. There is no guarantee there. In other words, this is not a magic wand that if you go through all these steps exactly right, they will always change their mind. But I will say this, you'll be surprised, if you go through all these steps, you'll be surprised at how few times they don't change their mind. I mean, that it really is surprising. But it's not a guarantee, and it doesn't work every time. Okay, and by the way, that's not what you're after anyway. That's between them and God. You're after doing your part and giving God the best opportunity to be able to work in them. So looking at figure 1 in your note taker, that number one thing, let me show it to you here on the PowerPoint, is check our attitude. And that begins early on. And we're talking about attitudes before we talk about actions, because our actions are the results of our attitudes. And so I'm going to get, now below that is a whole bunch of things that we're going to fill in. And so I want us to, what these are these are attitudes that can creep in to the workplace. And they are detrimental not only to what's going on in the workplace, but if you ever need to make an appeal, if these things have been present, that appeal is not going to work. So let's kind of go through these. The first one is this: an independent spirit is the basis of, and I guess there it is, an independent spirit is the basis of disloyalty. And while you're filling that in, let me talk about that for a moment. Not talking about an independent spirit in the fact that we like to be independent and all of that, but we're talking about in the workplace, about someone who just wants to go their own way. They're really not going to be part of the team. They're not really in step with their boss. And in the workplace, that independent spirit leads us to, you know what, we just see things differently. We're arguing with, with our boss. We find fault. Now we're starting to criticize. We second guess the things that are said. Look, in short, we're just being disloyal. And if your boss perceives you as being disloyal, it won't matter how valid your appeal is, he doesn't want to hear it. Because he knows you don't have his best interest at heart. You're just after yourself. And that will show up. And so if we find ourselves criticizing those that are in authority over us because we don't see eye to eye, then we have put our focus on the wrong thing. And even though, this is talking about the workplace, we can be disloyal in other areas as well. And I think it's not hard to make that connection. Let's do the next one now. A disrespectful spirit is the basis of disobedience. Now, what if I don't respect the authority over me? Well, it's important to distinguish between an authority's position under God and his human personality. We respect the position, and at the same time, we may be very aware of his personality deficiencies. Now, we can see all of that, but don't confuse those. Within the workplace, God requires this respectful spirit, because without it, what we're doing is giving Satan all that he needs to build this disobedient spirit. And so what you have is, people are not objecting to things because they're illegal or morally wrong or sinful. They're just disagreeing with stuff because they're just disagreeing. And that creates an atmosphere now that's adversarial, and your appeal will not work. In fact, you won't have any testimony toward those who are in authority in the workplace. Here's the third one. A condemning spirit is the basis of self-righteousness. Self-righteousness manifests itself when we compare our employer to ourselves, and we find reason to condemn their decisions. This is how the flesh attempts to justify us not doing what we have been asked to do, or refusing to do it the way we have been asked to do it. A condemning spirit is always looking for flaws, looking for reasons to object to what we're being told, so it can build itself up in the eyes of others. Now, God condemns self-righteousness in every area of our lives, not just with Him, but in every area. The self-righteous man may criticize his boss because he knows better than his boss. And maybe, you know what? And maybe he does. You say, I know more than my boss knows about my job. Listen carefully. You're supposed to. You know what a good boss does? He hires people who are better at things than he is. That's who you want to surround yourself with. If you're better than everybody else, then you're only going to go as far as you can take it. But if you surround yourself with people who know some things you don't know or have some skills you don't have, it makes the whole company better. So I don't like that criticism. I don't think God likes that criticism of, well, my boss doesn't know as much as I do. Great! Because that's what I would want to do. Get some people around me who are more skilled at some of these things than I am, so we can do better than I could do on my own. Here's the next one. An ungrateful spirit is the basis of pride. It's easy for prideful people to think they don't have very much to be grateful for. Because, after all, I'm earning my wages. They're not giving me anything. I'm earning my wages. Okay, I understand that. But here's the thing. You don't have an intrinsic right to a job. I can look at, I'm here and I can go, hey, you know what? I'm earning what I get paid. But here's the thing. I don't have an automatic right to be the pastor. So am I thankful for that? Yeah. So there's no law that says, you know what, they had to hire you. So you see these attitudes, the way they all work just like this. Here's the next one. A lazy spirit is the basis of poverty and dishonesty. It's easy to see how this works with poverty, because if you're lazy, you may wind up no longer having a job. And also, not just poverty, but dishonesty. Instead of thinking about how little we can do, we should be looking at this job to think, man, here's an opportunity for me to really hone this skill, to really get good at what I'm doing. I'm not going to get this story exactly right, but I'm going to repeat a story that Richard told me when Richard had a Boy Scout troop. And one of the things they were doing is they were learning to tie knots. Not enough for Richard to teach them to tie the knots. He taught them to tie the knots behind their back where they weren't looking. So when they went to competition, guess what? Yeah, they won. Why? Because they went further. Here's what most folks do in a job. They learn their job in about the first 6 months, and then they never get any better at it. They just keep doing the same thing for the next 25 years. And I'm just going to say that when we decide to be lazy about what we're doing, it really affects a lot of areas in our life. Here's the next one. A bitter spirit is the basis of selfishness. Now, people don't realize this, but when you allow yourself to become resentful about your job or about your boss, it starts a process of selfishness in you that you may not realize is happening. And by the way, if you begin to be selfish, that first core feature of godly love that we learned back in Romans 12 is not going to be working in you. Remember? Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think soberly according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. That we put that first core feature into the term selflessness. And so if you're going to have that godly love on the workplace, selfishness has no place. Here's the next one. An impure spirit is the basis of self-indulgence. When you allow yourself, and I'm going to give a broad spectrum here. When you allow yourself to entertain lustful thoughts in the workplace, You're laying the groundwork for moral failure. And you don't want to do that. Why? Because your thoughts are the basis for your actions. But it's not just restricted to moral failure. An impure spirit gets us thinking about ourselves. What am I owed? How unfairly am I being treated? And whether those things are happening or not. So it really takes the focus away from what you should be looking at. So what are we doing here? What are we doing in this first thing? I'm showing you that our attitude is the basis of our actions. And we almost never act independently of our attitude. I'm going to say that again. We almost never act independently of our attitudes. They are what drives us in almost everything we do. So if the time ever comes that you need to make an appeal to your boss because he's asked you to do something that you just can't do, if you're going to have any power behind that appeal, you will need to have been an employee that has the right kind of attitude in the workplace. Because if any of these things have been working in you, you have lost the credibility to make that appeal. I want to give you an illustration about this, kind of out of my own life. Now, I learned this some time back. I'd like to say I always practice it, but that's not right. But look, I was working at a church, but it didn't pay me very much. And so what I did is I started a janitorial company. We were cleaning buildings throughout Dallas. So we had about 12 buildings that we'd go to at night. And, we do all the stuff to clean the building, get it ready, for folks to come to work the next day. And that is probably the most mundane job in the world. I'm just telling you, just almost die of boredom with that. But anyway, it was a job. We had one of the buildings that I had the contract on was a medical equipment company in Plano. And in that medical equipment, it's a big business, a lot of people employed. And the president of the company was a very hands-on guy. And he was a little bit difficult to get along with. And that wasn't just for me, that was pretty much across the board. But as I spent time there, and he watched our work and kind of learned who we were, one day he came to me and he said, I would like to hire you to come to work for this company. And he said, I don't want you to clean the building anymore. I want you to hire people to do this building and you supervise them. He said, but I want you to oversee our investments because that's how the retirement of employees was going to get paid through certain investment ventures. He said, I'd like for you to oversee that. He said, but if you do it, I want you to come to work for me full time because I don't want you to be, continuing to clean these buildings. I wound up quitting doing that and going to work for him full time, and he made it very easy for me to do it. Not only did he pay me really good, not only did they give me a vehicle and they did all the upkeep and paid the gas and all of that on the vehicle, and not only was I eligible for a bonus at the end of the year, but because I was pastoring, he actually gave me Wednesdays off, because we have Wednesday night service, right? Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. He gave me Wednesdays off. So I only worked Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. I'm just going to, now, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this story, but I actually had real opportunities to talk to him about the Lord and about, biblical principles and things like that. He and his wife actually did come and attend the church a few times. I mean, it's a long ways away in Plano, but they did that. But what he began to do is have the company write a check to the church every month to support the ministry. Now, that is a long ways from where we were when I first started to work for him. Because, like I said, in the beginning it was a little bit difficult, but I earned his trust so that he was putting things into my hands. And here's what I'm going to tell you. I didn't get that from him. I mean, everybody else kind of looked at that and they were a little upset because they thought that was too sweet of a deal. Why would he do that for me? But here's the thing. I didn't get that because I was disrespectful or because I was lazy, or because any of those things that we just covered. And so because I knew those principles and tried to live by them, it gained me a place of respect in His eyes that paid off for me as an employee. And I continued to work there until I went to Glenrose and started the church there. And that's when I quit doing that. I'm just trying to give you an example. And by the way, He never asked me to do something that I thought was wrong or sinful or illegal. But here was the thing. I think I had enough clout with Him that if He had of, I would have been able to do what we're going to cover here and make an appeal. And it would have at least had some weight behind it. And I think it would have given God the best opportunity to work in His heart. Okay, so remember, this one takes place before we ever come to make an appeal. We have to have this kind of a track record. And the more time we have with our work, having the right kind of attitude, the more power our appeal will have. So we should do this from the start. The second step is something that you do if you find you haven't always had the right attitude. In other words, I didn't always know this, so what do I do now? So number 2 on your note taker is develop a conscience void of offense. And I'm going to give you the verse for this because this is something that the Apostle Paul is always paying attention to. And he's using this with regard to his ministry, but it's certainly going to work in the workplace as well. So let me give you the verse, and if you're not through copying that, I'll come back to it. But the verse is Acts chapter 24 and verse 16, where Paul says this, "And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man." So we have to ask ourselves, now I'll go back up if you're not through with that. But so what is a conscience that is void of offense? It means that our conduct around to them has not been offensive, so that, remember all those things we just talked about? You know, a spirit of disrespect and a spirit of laziness and, you know, all those kinds of things. If those are the things that are there, that's not having a conscience void of offense. That's having a conscience full of offense. So what you want to do is you want to wipe the slate clean on that. And so he's talking about our deportment. He's talking about the attitude with which we conduct ourselves around others, the way we interact with them, okay? And that either draws them to us or it pushes them away from us. Now, why is Paul concerned about why others perceive him? Okay, Gloria says trying to teach them things. Linda?
For them to be able to, for him to be able to minister to them later on, maybe.
Exactly right. Because Paul has a message, doesn't he? And if he has conducted himself toward everybody in an offensive type way, they're not going to give him the time of day. It doesn't matter. And so that's why it's important to conduct ourselves in a kind and godly way. And of course, we're talking about in the context of the workplace. You know what one of the biggest hindrances to getting a conscience that's void of offense for saying, by the way, we're going to talk about exactly how to do that in our steps that come after this, but one of the biggest reasons that people don't go back and readjust that is because they feel like that if they did something that was offensive to somebody in some way, that person was more in the wrong than they were. And they feel like now they're justified in conducting themselves that way. That's a very clever trap that the adversary lays for us. And so what we do is, if we feel guilty about it, what do we instantly do? We start to blame somebody else. And so when you start blaming everybody else, and that's what you're focused on, Look, you're not going to, you're trying to get rid of the guilt, but you know what you're going to wind up with in the end? You're going to wind up with both guilt and blame. You're not going to be able to escape that. The world always tries that, and it never works. Now, our natural inclination, and look, here's a guy at work, okay, and you know what? He's had these attitudes that have been, you know, the boss doesn't really trust him too much. He's not really sure. He's got all these things going on. So you know what happens? Is this guy now, he knows the boss doesn't like him, and so he goes around and he finds other people and he goes, boy, I don't know what's wrong with the boss. He kind of throws the boss under the bus. But you know what? He's wanting, and he's going to get it most of the time. He wants them to go, yeah, you know, that guy, he's just not a good, you know, that's what they want. And so they're kind of careful who they say it to because they want to do that. Here's the other thing too. You say, what if I'm not doing that? But somebody comes to me with that. And they're wanting me to kind of chime in with that. So here's the thing. When people are trying to live for God in the energy of their flesh, this is the way they do it. And you can't participate in that because all you're doing now is telling them, yeah, you're right to continue to have these bad attitudes. And that's not what you want to have. Okay, stop. Time out. You're in the book of Ephesians. You realize what that means. You're no longer in the simple son doctrine of Romans. Now you're being asked to do something. And this is supposed to take your edification to another level. That is not going to happen by continuing to do the things the flesh has always guided you to do. This has to change. And if it doesn't, your edification comes to a screeching halt. This is how it gets done. And you got to understand that when Satan whispers in your ear, I prayed this at the beginning. I know Satan is going to oppose this working in us because he doesn't want to see this. He realizes the power of it. So the flesh does all kinds of things. He's asking way too much. We'll find out. We'll find out at the judgment seat if I'm asking too much. Because I got a feeling that whatever I'm asking isn't going to be near as much as what the Lord Jesus expects after everything that He has done to justify and sanctify us and make this possible. That we live in a different way than the other people in this world. With me there? So I'm trying to help us here. Become the people that we are designed to be. That other way, look, that other way is a way of misery. You do know that. Have I ever worked a job where I didn't like the job or I didn't like the person I worked for? Yes. Yes. And so what did I do? I responded to that out of my flesh. So when the boss is around, I'm saying all the things I know he wants to hear, that's not what I'm thinking. And because I'm thinking something different and talking to other people about something different, you know what? My work life is miserable. Miserable. So because work is a divine institution and God puts some people in it, I say He puts them. You understand, there's positions of authority in every workplace and there's positions under authority in every workplace. And I have been in both of those. And if you're under authority, now you have an obligation to live differently. And that is the only life that is worth living. I'm not trying to make it tough. I'm not trying to make it hard. There's no bonus in this for me. There is. Your edification. The glory that you're investing in for eternity. That's what's at stake here. Okay? So how do we do it? Now let's go through the note taker on this. The first thing is we correct any wrong attitudes. That's the first thing you have to do. If you located a bad attitude, now you've got to go to work on correcting that. And you can look at that list or you can just think about it on your own And we have to get that done. And how does that happen? By prayer, supplication with thanksgiving. That verse that we worked on last week, apply those principles to this. Here's the next thing. Fulfill any unfinished directions. If you've had a resistant spirit that has caused you to say, well, I'm not doing that. But it's not because it was sinful, but you just, you know what, you just didn't want to do it because you're upset or you're mad or whatever. Then the first thing you have to do is correct any wrong attitudes. Let's change those. And then, if there was anything that you have been asked to do that you have been dragging your feet on because you're just trying to pay them back, go do those and get those done. Here's the next one. Acknowledge our wrong and ask forgiveness. This is a tough one, but it's necessary. Go to your boss and make things right concerning your previous attitudes, and do it with some humility. This is not the way to do it. I'm really sorry that I've had a disrespectful spirit toward you, but you're just not a very good boss. See, you just undid everything you were trying to do. Stop that. Stop that. You know what? People do this in every relationship they have. Instead of just owning their part of it, they got to make sure the other person knows they're not innocent either. They need to come to that understanding. And look, if you think you're going, look, have you ever just said that and people went, you know, you say, and you're not a very good boss, and your boss would go, you know, you're right. I've really been under conviction a lot lately about it. I'm just not. Do you think that's what happens? You live in a fairy tale? That is a fairy tale. If that work doesn't get done in their inner man, it's just not going to get done. By the way, it's not going to get done in us either. Unless it gets done in our inner man. Not because somebody told you that. All right. And by the way, and we're not on bosses yet. We are going to be. But see, if the boss thinks the only way to do this is to tell an employee what a bad employee is, how many employees does he think will ever look at that and go, you know what, you're right, I'm going to change? Oh, no, that doesn't happen either. So everybody's got something to learn here. Okay, so we go to our boss. Look, why is that so hard to do? Why would it be hard to go to your boss and say, because here's what you want to do. You want to wipe that slate clean so that now you can exhibit the right attitude and have some power and influence and gain the respect of your boss. And there is a way to do that. But why is that so hard to do? Just one little word. Pride. Boy, we just don't like to humble ourselves. We just don't like to do it. You realize who you're doing this for. This is not for your boss. This is unto the Lord. He's the one that designed work. And work has to have people in authority and people under authority. And you know what? Usually, we all have somebody above us and we have somebody below us. That's usually the way it works. Now someone says, hey, I'm the president of the company. I don't have anybody above me. Well, Paul disagrees. Yeah, you do. And that's the Lord. And you're going to report to Him. So we all kind of wind up in that chain. It's essential, I think, for us to clear the air, confess any wrong actions against those that we've offended. I know it can be difficult, but once it's difficult not because we're prideful, but it's also difficult because Satan is kicking and screaming to keep you from doing that. And here's the thing I want you to understand. If you don't do that, you may think no one really knows how you're feeling, but the truth is, by the things that you do, and by the attitude you do them with, and by the emotions that you experience, everybody around us recognizes what's going on with us. We don't think they do because we're just not saying it outright. You ever been around somebody and you just knew they weren't happy? They weren't pleased? They're not saying anything? You don't have to live in this life very long and you can pick up on those cues. And I'm not trying to teach us that. I'm just saying we think no one knows. Here's the thing, everybody knows. Everybody knows when this person is discontent because it shows up. So more than we realize, here's what's happening. People are, because we go, I don't understand why the people are treating me that way. Because they're responding to your attitude. No, you may have not said a word, but they're responding to your attitude because they see that. So what's the cure for that? It's to learn to judge ourselves and our attitudes so that we can take care of those things, so that others don't judge us and we won't be judged by the Lord at the judgment seat. Here's the next one. If this has resulted in some kind of dishonesty or attitude, then make restitution when necessary. If you took something that you shouldn't have taken, you need to make restitution for that. That's the sign that you mean business. And then here's the last one. Be willing to limit your freedoms in order to avoid offending others. And in your notes, you'll see we talked about this extensively on Tuesdays in our 1 Corinthians study in chapters 8 and 10. Extensively we talked about this. So I'm not going to reteach that here, but I've given you the reference for that so you can go look at it on your own. Now the next step is going to concern what happens if we really are asked to do something that is wrong. Here's what you have to do. Here's the work that has to go on in you. So number 3 is discern basic intentions. In other words, ask yourself, by my boss asking me to do this thing, what is he trying to accomplish? What's his goal here? Okay, in fact, that's the next thing. So what you have to do is you have to ask your boss, what's the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish? Have a conversation. And let me give you some guidance here. This conversation should be a normal conversation where you're trying to figure out what are they thinking. So don't do it angrily or outraged. I can't believe you're asking me to. No. Have a conversation and just say, what are we trying to accomplish here? Because you know what you're going to do. You're going to make an appeal at the end, and you don't want to derail that before you get there. So find out what it is by asking your boss what his goals are. And then the next thing is find their frame of reference in the instructions that they have given you. Why is it they're thinking this is what we ought to do? Now I'm going to tell you the frame of reference comes in 2 parts. First, a wrong frame of reference on our part comes from thinking that when we're told to do something wrong, we only have 2 choices. We either tell them no, or we just do what was wrong. That's the wrong reference for that. Because there's way more choice than just that. The wrong frame of reference on the part of our authority is just find out what's going on with them that makes them give you this wrong command. And you can do that in this conversation. Here's the next one. Ask the person in authority to point out any blind spots. Do you know how many times employees have ever come to their boss and said, you know what, I really haven't had the kind of attitude here that I should have had, and I'm changing on that. And you know what, I know that God is working with me, and so I'm going to come to you and tell you that, you know, I'm sorry that I didn't have that before, but I plan on having that now. And then you could just say, are there any blind spots that you see with me that would help me in this process? This is really important. If you're not willing to hear the answer, don't ask that question. Because you're probably not going to get that. If you're expecting, we don't see anything. Okay, probably going to be disappointed. The effort to say, do I have any blind spots, has to be a genuine effort. And if they point something out, then you need to go to work on that without walking away from there thinking, who does that guy think he is telling me I'm... Don't ask the question unless you're really serious about doing it. So you have to be able, and that means you don't go around looking for confirmation about that. Well, guess what the boss told me today? I evidently have a blind spot. Okay, you know what that tells me? You're not interested in doing this work. You're just interested in everybody patting you on the back like there's nothing wrong. We don't like to hear that, but you have to be able to do that kind of difficult work in every relationship. Now, again, because this is the nature of the thing that it is, I'm going to give you another personal illustration. The other one looked good for me. This one does not. So I actually had a time when someone came to me and told me about my blind spot. And I'm going to be honest with you. It stung pretty good. Now, I did know how I was supposed to respond. I did understand that. I mean, I understood what we're talking about here. I understood this. But just because you understand it doesn't mean that when I do it, it's going to be easy. And that really did. I took offense. They didn't mean it as an offense, but I took offense at it. And because I did, I'm hoping I'm not the only one in the room, but it made me struggle to try to honestly do the work on this thing that they pointed out. You know what immediately happened in my mind when they did that? I thought of 3 reasons why I was justified to do that. That's the first thing. And that's a danger signal. And you know what? I knew that was a danger signal. You know what that made me want to do? Find a fourth. Let me just double down on it. All right, so here's what I'm going to tell you. When I finally was able to engage in a genuine practice of saying, and you know what? And you can say, Lord, if that's really true of me, I need you to let me know. Look, you're not there yet when you're asking that kind of a question. But and I'm not gonna give anybody a hard time that's trying to work through it, because I know how hard that was for me. But listen, I'm going to tell you something. When I honestly did the work on that, you know what I found out? They were right. They were right. Was that a blow to my ego? Yep. But they were right. And so I went to work on it. And I'm going to tell you what, God literally transformed the direction of my ministry through that single instance. Now, is that something you hope happens to you every day? I mean, that'd be a little painful. But you know what? If you're honestly going to engage with this, you have to be willing to hear it. Now we're talking about it in the context of, I haven't always had the right attitude. I'm going to go to my boss, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to ask him to point out any blind spots. Here's the last one, and number 3. Discern God's goal in the situation. And this one is critically important, because this is not just about you getting ahead in the workplace, although it will. This is really about what is God trying to do through you in the workplace. I can give you a couple, it doesn't matter what the illustration is, I can give you some possible ones here. Maybe God wants to put godliness on display to your boss. And this is a way to do it. Maybe your boss isn't saved, and this conversation that you're having with him is an opportunity now that may lead to you giving him the gospel. Maybe he is saved, but this is an opportunity to remind him that we're all going to report to God, and you may actually help him get his spiritual life in order. What is God trying to do here? You see what I'm saying? Discern what it is you think the Lord might do in the midst of this, because that is a valuable thing to be able to identify. Okay, And once you discern what your boss is trying to achieve, don't just say, well, I'm not going to do what you said. Demonstrate, and because, look, I know this will sound crazy, but some people are looking for a way to be martyred. That's not what we're after. What we're after is for God to do a work in the life of this guy so that he sees this is not the way to do it, but there's a better way to do this. That's what we're really after. Okay, number 4. So now that you've had this conversation with your boss, number 4 says, design creative alternatives. In other words, ask yourself, is there another way to accomplish this goal without committing sin or without us, doing wrong? How do we do that? How can we accomplish what my boss is trying to accomplish, but let's do it in the right way? Now, you're formulating your plan on your own right here, okay? So the first thing that you're going to have to do in order to get this done is remove any resistant spirit to being creative. Remember I told you a while ago when someone pointed out my blind spot, and it took me a while before I could just honestly go to work on that? Because the first thing that had to happen is I had a spirit that was resistant to acknowledging that I had a blind spot. That's the first work I had to do, is to get rid of that so that I could honestly look at myself. So we have to do the same thing. And by the way, the flesh will give you all kinds of things. Well, look, my boss wants to do this and it's not the right thing to do. It's not my job to go figure out a creative alternative to that. That's not what they're paying me to do. You forget what we're doing here. This isn't about what you're being paid to do. This is about how you're supposed to live as an adopted son or daughter of your heavenly Father, putting some things on display in this world that they're never going to see from someone else. That's what this is about. This is what you've been called to do. So, as a believer in Jesus Christ, that is your job. It is. And you can't get away from that. Now, I'm not going to take the time, because I know we're already going to be full. I'm not going to take the time to cite these in the Scripture, but if you remember the stories of Joseph and Daniel, how that in an enemy's land, they were elevated to great positions of authority, of governmental authority in the government and land of their enemies. Why? Because they understood principles that were, I know it was under the law and all that kind of stuff, but they understood principles that God honored, and they lived by those principles, and it gained them a respect in the eyes of those authorities that were over them. And so we're not going to go look at those, but I think just saying it will kind of bring it to your remembrance. Here's the next one. Use difficulties to expand your frame of reference. And what am I saying by that? I'm saying just because something is difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't try to find this alternative. Get creative. Do some research. How does someone else get this done without breaking the law or causing people to sin? How does this getting done by, find a way to do that. And invest some time and effort into that. Here's the next one. Gain insight from the doctrine. We talk about this so much, I don't need to give you any commentary on this. The doctrine is always going to inform our thinking. And then lastly, in number 4, now after you've done all of that, design an alternative to accomplish this goal. And then once you've designed this alternative, okay, bring it to your boss and make the presentation. This is your appeal for trying to get what he wants done in a way that doesn't cause you to sin against God or to do something that is wrong. That leads us to number 5, the actual appeal to authority. So that's number 5, and now we'll fill this in, and this is going to be pretty short here. How do we make our appeal? Well, it's important to do it with the right attitude. That means to do it the right way if it's going to be successful. So what would that entail? Well, number one, have the spirit of a learner and servant. We're talking about humility. So when you come with this alternative plan, don't do it in a condescending way or a prideful way. Don't come across like you have all the answers or that you know better than your boss. You may know better than your boss, but you know that isn't the issue here. You know why? Because you ain't the boss. So come across here because you are one under authority, and what you're after is not put your fingers on your suspenders and say, look what I did. What you're after is for God to do a work in the mind of your boss so that this can be averted and you don't have to suffer for it. That's really what we're after here, is for God to do that work. Here's the second one. Explain your convictions without condemning your boss. Explain to him why you cannot break the law, why you cannot do this because you understand it to be a sin against God. But then also include that you want to achieve the goals of the company, provided they're legitimate goals. Okay? This is an opportunity. Here is the opportunity to showcase your faith. I can't do this because it causes me to sin against God. And I know that's not what you're trying to get anybody to do. And that's why I've created an alternative here that will accomplish what you want to do without putting us in this position. And by the way, make this part short and concise. Don't turn it into a sermon. Okay, so boss man, I just want you to understand this. So here, I'm going to play Brother Mike's sermon for you. And an hour and 15 minutes later, when he's lapsed into a coma, okay, yeah, that's right. So just make this one concise and to the point. You're not trying to belabor what an evil, bad guy he is. You're just explaining why you can't do it that way. And then, after you explain your convictions, here's the next one. Present your creative alternative. Here it is. Here's how I think we can get this done. The next thing is explain how it will reach his goal. It will accomplish what he wants to have it accomplish, but you can do this now with a clear conscience. And then here's the last one, and this is really important. Leave the final decision up to him. You don't need to give him an ultimatum. I'll tell you one thing, if you can't come around on this, I'm walking. Stop. It's not about you. It's about what you want God to do in him. Okay? So, let the final decision be with him. He's going to decide. By the way, when you give somebody an ultimatum like that, you know what happens? Pride rises up in them, and now what do they want to do? Yeah, you're fired. That's what Richard knows. You're fired. Okay, you can't quit. I fired you. Okay. Now, all right. So, now, only when you have applied the above 5 steps are we ready for step 6. So once you've done that, if he looks at everything you've done, can I just real quickly rehearse this? He's looking at an employee that has either had a really good attitude in all the things that he's doing, or at some point he came and said, hey, I'm going to be a different employee. I'm really sorry for this bad attitude, but the Lord is teaching me some things. And if there's a blind spot pointed out to me, that gains you some respect. You don't think so in the moment because your flesh doesn't like that. Can I give you one more illustration about that? That was rhetorical. I'm going to give it to you anyway. That is, how many times have I had to stand up here and say, hey, I was looking at something wrong. Remember not long ago, I talked about Jesus praying in the garden, let this cup pass from me. And I said, you know what, that wasn't about the cross. Oh, I had that wrong, and I did that whole thing. I really want to be more committed to getting it right than committed to me always being right, But there's something, it's either your flesh or maybe it's Satan, always whispering in the back of your mind. If you tell people you had this wrong, they're never going to trust you on anything else. But you know what I have found? That has gained me more respect from people to be willing to say, hey, I didn't have that right. Let's look at the Scripture and look at that. And every time that happens, it's a little bit of a surprise because you're kind of expecting maybe the other shoe to drop, the other way. And when it doesn't happen, it's kind of a confirmation that you've done the right thing. Okay, so number 6 is you've made all of this presentation and you're the kind of employee he really wants, and you've gone to the trouble to design a creative alternative, and you laid it out in a very non-condemning way, and now you have given him the best opportunity to change his mind and save face as the boss. But what if he says, no, we're doing it, this is how I want it, this is what we're doing, this is it? What do you do then? Number 6, you suffer for not doing wrong. Well, that's the next point. You're going to have to suffer whatever it is. So, what could that be? Well, the boss is mad at me. Okay, well, you'll just have to suffer that. All right? Or, you know what? He takes you off the project and he puts someone else on the project. Okay, well, you'll have to suffer that. Well, maybe he fires me. Well, maybe he does. It just depends on what's important to you here. I'm not trying to make that decision for you. But you have to be willing to suffer for not doing what is wrong. And then here's how you're supposed to do that. Number 1, suffer, why did I not have that up there? Suffer willingly. In other words, be willing to do this. Okay? Number 2, suffer with humility, which means don't complain about it. Remember when Jesus was going to the cross and they're saying all these things? He's totally innocent. Totally innocent. He's not defending all that. Without complaint. It says he opened not his mouth. Well, if we're going to suffer for doing the right thing, just take it. Do it willingly, do it with humility, and here's the last one, and doing it with rejoicing. Why? Because, look, not only have you done the right thing, not only have you honored God in your decision, but you have done it the right way. And that's worth something. To know that you're not only doing the right thing, but you've done it the right way, and God has been honored in the whole process. So when we work for someone in the way Paul's about to explain in verses 5 through 9, this process gives power to any appeal that we would make to an authority. And so what Paul is about to teach us here in these verses is if the time ever comes that we're given an evil command, our appeal will have weight and power to be able to work in the lives of those who have authority. All right, so let me close off with this, and then we'll have a word of prayer. What we do with this, and with every doctrine, of course, what we do with it is going to show up at the judgment seat. Now, I'm not saying that to try to leverage you, but I want to remind you that when we get done at the judgment seat of Christ, I believe we're all, now let me say it this way. After the judgment seat, we are all still individually recognizable. Some folks have the idea we're all just identical clones after that. I don't think that's right. I think just as I can look out and I can see Ruby and I can see Sarita and I can see Benny and I can tell, how can I tell? Because the way I see your physical form. But here's what happens at the judgment seat. We get turned inside out. Okay, not physically. Oh, good, our guts are on the outside. No. What I mean by that is all of the work that Jesus has been doing in your inner man, that is now going to be how you are known and recognized forever from that time forward. I really don't think this is so much, I'm not going to debate about the physical forms. I don't think they're identical clones. But what we're looking at is the sum total of the work that He has done in us to conform us to His image. And that's how you're going to be known, that's how you're going to be recognized, and that's what people will see. So in eternity, here's Eric in eternity, and you know what I would be able to say to him? Eric, because now you know what I'm seeing in him? I'm seeing all the work that Jesus has done in him. That's how I'm recognizing him. That is being manifest. And now I can say, hey, Eric, you are looking more like yourself than you ever did before. Because that's the real him. You see what I'm saying? And in eternity, it's not about this, it's about what's in there, but now that gets manifested outwardly, and that's what everybody's looking at. So it's not going to be anybody looking at it going like, I just really like your hair. No, it's going to be that inward man by which we are known. And when you stop, look, I don't know, I'm saying this to you because this makes a profound impact on me to think, because we have this idea that nobody really knows what's going on in me. One day we'll all know. Because it'll be manifest to everyone. We won't be able to hide that. Because if there's not anything there, it's going to show up. And if there is something there, it's going to show up. You know, there's that principle in the Scripture, right? I know it's not talking about that thing, but it's talking about those things that are done in secret. Well, they're going to be revealed to everybody. Well, I'm just saying there's a very similar principle that after the judgment seat of Christ, your whole appearance by which people will recognize you and know who you are is going to be because of the work that has been done in your inner man, which is now the outwardly manifested to all. So if you realize that, then responding to this doctrine, should I just make that first statement again? How we respond to this doctrine and every doctrine from here on out is meant to be doing that work in our inner man. And that's what we're going to be wearing in our glorified body for all eternity. So for me, that makes an impact on me. And so I really want to look at myself and go, Lord, and look, okay, I'll keep talking and we'll be here another 15 minutes. You get the idea, right? Okay, all right, there it is. Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, while we hope we never have to make an appeal, we do want to be the kind of godly employees that you have designed for us to be. May our work life be unto you in every area. And I pray that we'll be reflectors of your image in our work. Your name is at stake in us, so may we behave ourselves accordingly. Our future is tied to how we live this life, and you, God, are the perfect judge. You will know exactly how to parse all of that out. May we accomplish what you have left us here to do. May we be the sons and daughters you've designed for us to be. Use us to minister within the divine institution of work. And may these verses in Ephesians effectually work to transform us to your glory. And as we live this doctrine, may we manifest your holiness to the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay.
Amen.